My name is Kerry Lonergan. I'm from the ABC's Landline program, and it's my pleasure to be here today as your MC for this very important event. And it's very important for a lot of reasons, but we'll hear about later on. But one of the reasons is that everyone in this room has something in common, and that is one day we will die. And all things being equal, if we've worked hard or if we've been a bit lucky, we will have something to leave to our loved ones. And usually that sort of transition can be smooth, peaceful, and sometimes it can be as rough as the 10-mile road. So what you're going to hear today is something that will make things easier for you and something to make you think about really concentrating on succession planning. The seminar will have 3 segments. First of all, a presentation on farm succession planning by Ian Congram. He's the Managing Director of Powers Financial Group. That'll be followed by a question and answer panel on farm succession planning, during which you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of our panel, which will comprise Peter Ward, Westpac Head of Agribusiness in Queensland, Georgie Somerset, Beef Producer, QRAA Member, Immediate Past President of the Queensland Rural Women's Network, Jeff Arnold, Director of Powers Financial Group, Andrew Jamison, Agribusiness Consultant with Powers, Carly Burnham, a beef producer from Monto, Roger Nobbs, beef producer from Mara, and David Hutchinson, a cotton grower from Theodore. Following that, there'll be a presentation on the benefits of the cloud by Nick Pollins. He's a Director of Business Advisory for Powers, and that'll be followed by an interview from Nick to Chris Carver, who is a guest here today, and he's one of the bosses of Telstra in Queensland. Now, let me introduce Ian Congram. Ian is the Managing Director of Powers Financial Group, Chartered Accountants and Business Advisor. He lives in Brisbane but spreads his time across all of Powers' offices, which are situated at Billawheeler, Rockhampton, Brisbane and Monto. A Fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants and a Chartered Tax Advisor, Ian advises a diverse client base on taxation and business matters, but his passion is working with agribusiness families to help them achieve their goals, and succession planning is a major goal. Ian grew up on a mixed farming operation on the outskirts of Brisbane and attended Queensland Ag College, where he obtained a degree in rural technology, specialising in meat science and animal production. After graduating, he went on to have a career in the meat industry, working first for Queensland Bacon, followed by a research role with the Livestock and Meat Authority of Queensland. He then went into business for himself, establishing Brisbane's first gourmet sausage shop, which grew into a sizable wholesale and retail business. How's this for a career change? He went from a sausage maker, he decided on a career change in direction, and he moved to Billawheeler, where he joined the well-established accounting firm of Power Brothers. He studied externally to obtain his MBA and then went on to become a chartered accountant. In 1996, he became a director of Powers. 2002, he took on the role of managing director. Under Ian's leadership, the firm has gone from a staff of 25 to the 70-strong team the firm has today. Ian's greatest enjoyment comes from assisting rural families with farm succession and business restructures. Please make him welcome from sausage maker to managing director, Ian Congram.
Thanks, Kerry. That little bit of my past isn't something I always reveal, but I decided with this audience we had to get it out there. Okay? It's one of those well-kept secrets sometimes. So thank you for attending today, and I hope to share with you a lot of insights and experiences I've gained over 25 years of working with prime producers. The talk, I'll go through how we do the succession planning process, and we'll have a number of case studies. In the material on your seats, there are 3 case studies that I'm sure you'll find interesting, and then we'll look forward to some interesting questions. We won't take questions during my talk. We'll save them all up for the Q&A session, if you don't mind. So we'll get started. Okay. These lights going to stay on, the bright ones? They always stay under there? Anyway, the important note that everybody needs to be always thinking about the succession of their business, and I've heard it said that succession planning for a farmer starts on the day your second child is born, and it doesn't finish until the day you die. So it's not just okay, we're going to sit down and do succession planning today and it's done. It's an ongoing process the whole time. You need to get your family involved, and you also need to make sure you get the right professional advice. So what are your objectives for your farming business? We always need to be thinking about these, and most typically they are always focused on how do we grow capacity. It doesn't mean you necessarily want to get bigger, but be able to produce more from what you've got, and improve the efficiency of operations, and importantly to have a sustainable business and farm that you're going to be able to hand on through the generations and look after the land. All businesses are always seeking to improve productivity and to boost the cash flow. It's important to manage your business risks and to try to avoid losses where possible. That's not always easy when in your business, when you're subject to the fluctuations in markets and weather events. Succession planning is an important tool to help try to reduce potential for family disputes, and also you need to be always looking to help with the development of your family members. And one of the big objectives is trying to plan a fair and equitable transfer of farming wealth. And absolutely, number one is to try to ensure that there's going to be enough money in the pot to enable the current generation to be able to retire and have a happy and comfortable later years of their life. So let's just get into talking about the succession planning process. Successful enterprises, they always need to have a clear plan for their future direction, growth and family succession. And the first steps in succession planning are to identify your personal goals, identify your business objectives, make sure you have a shared family vision, and get down on document what are all your main concerns. If you don't start there, you'll miss a lot of the issues. Just getting your will updated is not alone enough to address family succession. You need to be proactive and communicate with your future successors, and communicate what your retirement plans are to your family. It's important you get them involved. You need to be, the current owners need to still be in control until it's agreed on what the plans for it are, and getting you participating and getting everybody participating in the process allows all family members to play a part. So the advantages of doing succession planning in a more formal way and getting the family involved is that it has the potential to reduce family conflicts, will give the successor generation a clearer understanding of what their entitlements are, and so they can plan ahead accordingly. And that's important, even if it's going to be an unfavourable outcome. It's quite unfair to make promises that aren't ever going to be delivered. And I know of cases where it's always been said, you know, that one day this will be yours, and that and where the next generation has stayed on and worked on for even a couple of decades until eventually then the parents changed their mind and sold it all, and you know, and they had to have a complete change of direction. So it's just, I think you've got to be very clear and not make false promises. The disadvantages, of course, of doing this and sharing it all with the family is that it can be an emotional experience and can bring issues to the surface. But I think you owe it to your family to tackle those hard steps. Otherwise, there will always be some unresolved conflict. But it does require action and effort to implement a plan, and also importantly to take it all the way through. The first step, once you're committed to doing this, is to align the expectations between the generations. because it's very common that there's different expectations between the current farm owners and managers and the successors. To do this, when we are working with clients, we use a growth and succession planning assessment tool, and there's two different versions. One that is designed to identify the needs and expectations of the owners, and another one that is used for the successor generation to try to prompt and get out the right what they're thinking. So out of doing those assessments, we can help identify what each person's goals are and what their expectations are. This next slide just illustrates how the two different generations might be thinking. The owners, their main focus for the business is trying to improve efficiencies and just to make sure the business is going to be secure. They could be thinking that, they don't really have to worry about succession until more than 5 years away. But they do want to have an equitable wealth distribution amongst their children. They're looking to increase capacity of the operation, and their idea of growth is to invest in new equipment and introduce new bloodlines into the business. And their main performance focus is trying to minimise costs, whereas the more ambitious next generation, their focus is thinking they should buy another farm, upgrade equipment and increase capacity, which generally would go with borrowing money. Their timeframe succession will be thinking that it should happen now rather than later, and they would like to own the whole thing. That I said they want looking to buy another farm and expand, and growth is generally going to be involved borrowing money, which mum and dad probably necessarily aren't that keen on. So how do you get the two to meet? That's the challenge. The next step usually we follow is going through in a workshop situation is to complete a farm SWOT analysis, which is the old strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, which you'd all be familiar with. Work through them together to try to ensure consensus is reached, and to identify how you can counter your weaknesses and bolster your strengths, and then take advantage of opportunities that you identify. So it's all about providing all family members with a sound understanding of business risks and the need for ongoing strategic business and financial planning. I won't go through this slide in detail, but it's just an example of how the different issues are raised and agreed on, and you get them all documented down in the SWOT format, and then from those they can lead on to developing strategies that will take advantage of the strengths to take up the opportunities, try to build on overcome the weaknesses, and do things that are going to try to avoid the threats of that you're facing. So it's not always easy to tackle the succession planning topic, and the one fear, of course, a lot of the people that are facing retirement is will they have enough funds for retirement? Is there enough equity to be able to pass the enterprise on? Are they prepared to relinquish control? Are their successors capable of running the business as well as they have? Maybe they're scared that the next generation might do it better and show them up. Are they going to be able to achieve an equitable wealth distribution between their children? And equitable doesn't always mean equal. Are they going to be able to do this in a way that the family assets are still going to be protected from events such as relationship breakdowns and other unforeseen events? And are the retiring or the older generation still going to have secure income? So it's important to, once you start getting to this stage, is to be obtaining professional advice to ensure that the assets are still going to be protected and that the older generation is still going to have a secure income in retirement. Because there are too many stories of where families have given away the farming business on assets and then been left high and dry by the younger generation. So for the successors, they're the things that can be roadblocks is whether they do have the commitment to the business. Often, sometimes the parents mightn't feel that they do have. Maybe that's because there is too much uncertainty of what the direction is. So you need to do the succession planning process to overcome those uncertainties. And I think I pressed the wrong button. Yep. Okay. Are the expectations of the successors reasonable and fair, especially compared to what, taking into account of their siblings and the rest of their family? Are they going to be able to afford to pay out the off-farm siblings? That's often the stumbling block. And what are the relationships like between the family? And will they be able to maintain happy relationships between family members? Again, what's the acumen and capability of the younger generation? And then if there's skills deficiencies or knowledge, then there's got to be a program of personal development put in place to overcome those. I also have experienced that that the older generation is used to working with a professional advisors and built up strong relationships over the years, but the younger generation hasn't had that opportunity because they haven't been involved in the financial affairs as much of the business. And I believe it's important to get the younger generation involved early and be open with them about the finances of the business, and then that'll help them also develop a trust in the professional advisors, and because they have to learn to take advice, and they won't do that if they've never had exposure much to professional advisors. So the big question is, can you afford to retire? To determine that, we use a tool called a farm value gap analysis, and that's about looking at what the total asset and equity position is and the income generating ability of the farming enterprise, and particularly what off-farm assets there are, and how can that off-farm asset pool be increased to provide an income stream for the older generation when they do step away from the business. So you need to be aware of what your farm value is, and to be able to work out what your farm value gap is, and then if there's a shortfall, you've got to work on plans on how you're going to overcome that and work out the time frame you have to do that in. And that can be quite a rude shock to some people when they face the truth that there just isn't enough there, at this point in time to enable it to happen. So then the answer is you've got to work out a plan that how do we achieve it and build up the additional equity and increase the profit levels to afford to be able to make it work. But the important thing I think is that people do need to try to build up some off-farm investments because I see it time and time again, opportunities come along, the business is going well, and then it just always tends to be, we'll sink it back into the farming enterprise and we'll go on and buy and expand that one. But every time you keep building the farming enterprise, it makes it harder often for the to have an equitable distribution amongst the children, because when there's no off-farm assets, it's a tough decision to have to sell properties or to even put force onto the successors who are going to take over managing the enterprise to have to be paying out their siblings. I know that have some certain clients that do have situations where they have annual payments to make to their siblings, and they hate it, and it sticks in their throat every time they write their check out. But so I know it's not necessarily the ideal situation to end up in, and if you can build that off-farm investment pie early, it will make it so much easier. So what is succession planning? There's two distinct parts to it. The first one is about management succession, which is a separate issue from the ownership of the farming assets, and you generally should be doing the succession in two stages, being to have the transition of management first, most likely including transfer of the lower value assets being livestock and machinery and working capital, with the land assets being done in a second stage and possibly not even transferring until death. It's important to separate them, one, to really give the successor generation a chance to prove themselves in managing the business, and it enables the older generation to step back but still be guiding along the way, and without putting at risk any of the valuable land assets. Because it's important to do work on setting up tax-effective structures for security and of those land assets, and to also minimise capital gains tax when the transfer does occur, and to set up the next generation, if possible, with the highest possible capital gains tax cost base. Land transfers always have to be done carefully to try to minimise the amount of transfer duty payable, and it's worth considering the option of transferring passing land assets into testamentary trusts, or even possibly into a family trust while you're still alive, because trusts can live on for 80 years, and while it's in the trust, control of the trust can be passed on from one generation to the next without triggering any stamp duty problems, even if there is debt being taken over. So it's all about trying to achieve much greater certainty about your farm objectives and life plans. The key is to start early and communicate. If you do that, get the family involved, it'll all be a much better outcome, and will lead to having more people involved successfully in the enterprise and building the growth and scale to ultimately achieve realistic retirement options for the older generation. So I'll go quickly over these next two slides. They illustrate how we tackle it, identifying what the objectives are, and then what the plan is to achieve those. So there'll be objectives for the farm management succession transition, and then also a different set of objectives for the farm ownership transition. Of course, we've got, we're up the top there, we've got the do nothing, just make sure the will is set right, and that can be a perfectly good plan for the transfer of the land assets, provided the will is done correctly and take into account all necessary things. But even though the will might be the only legal documentation you need for the succession of the land asset, it all has to be done as part of the communicating family involved process, to make the family aware of what is the plan for passing over the farm properties. So let's talk about how do we protect assets. The risks are marriage breakdown, settlements, or accidental death, and these things can contribute to the forced breakup of business assets. When we talk about, I'll give you an example of one of these where it ended fairly tragically. I had a client who had a smallish farm and he was into his 80s and decided that he would like to get an age pension, and at the particular time the government was having a push and there was a window of concession to gift the farming assets over without affecting the pension assets test. Maybe it was about 10 years ago at that time, and he gave the whole of the farming property, the cattle machinery, over to his son without obtaining advice, and because unfortunately sometimes clients do these things and you find out as an advisor you found about them later, and this was one of those cases. He gave it all over to his son with no clawback provisions, no security measures, because you couldn't do that if you wanted to access the age pension. Only within 1 year of that happening, the son's wife told him she was leaving him and left, and about a week later he killed himself, and his will at the time said everything went to his wife. So the wife received all of the assets from the farming business, and his sisters ended up getting nothing, because the father had given it over to the son, and obviously he wasn't providing for his sisters, but unfortunately the whole thing was lost out of that family. So that's what can happen if you don't get the right advice, because it depends on what your objectives are. But it is important to do what you can to protect the assets, to try to keep them in the family, and often the easiest way to do that is to retain ownership until death. You've got to make sure your will's done right. It's often the best situation is to have your will written in to put the land assets into a testamentary trust, which will give flexibility to the next generation to keep that asset secure, and then that trust can be used to continue to pass control down to the next generations easily. So let's get on to taxes. I've given it the heading succession taxes, even though there is no such thing, but capital gains tax can effectively be a tax on transfer of assets to one generation to the next. And the other one, of course, is transfer duty, otherwise known as stamp duty. Pre-capital gains tax assets, which are assets acquired before 1985, they transfer on death at their market value. It's important to get a valuation at the time, because that valuation will establish what the beneficiary's cost base is for capital gains tax. The same applies if you do a transfer while you're alive. You get a valuation, and there's of course no capital gains impact on the transferor, but it sets up the transferee's cost base. But often it is not a good idea to transfer while you're alive from a capital gains point of view, because the longer you leave it, the higher the cost base is going to be for the next generation. Except if the situation where you might want to actually go ahead and transfer to the next generation while you're alive, if you're concerned about challenges to the will by other family members if you were to leave the asset to pass under the will. Because once an asset's given during your life, it doesn't form part of your estate anymore and it can't be challenged. For post-capital gains tax assets, the successor inherits your cost base, so they stand in your shoes exactly. Whatever it cost you, that's what the deemed cost is for that person inheriting it, even though it might be worth a lot more at the time. So effectively means the successor can inherit a future capital gains tax issue. And that is where you need to plan carefully, because it could be worth considering, if you can establish that you're eligible for the small business capital gains tax concessions, it could be worth transferring that property while you're alive to trigger a disposal transaction and reset the cost base, because if you're in that over 55 age group, the concessions are very broad, and generally you'll be able to pass over the asset without paying any capital gains tax, and it sets the next generation up with a market value cost base. Whereas if you wait till death, they'll inherit your cost, and who knows what's ahead with tax law changes, and it is always possible that they might par back some of these concessions, because they are actually very, very good. And I think the case study I'll illustrate to you might show you that. And if you aim to do a transfer and access small business concessions, you need to look at, see if you can, if your business turnover is up over the 2 million mark, or your net assets are over 6 million, you might need to look at ways to engineer things to achieve that eligibility. And that's where you need the professional advice, because it is quite a complex area of tax law, and there are a lot of traps in it. When it comes to stamp duty, which is the thing we all hate paying, and it is a major impost on the transfer of assets, you should try to structure the transfer of assets and the mix of assets in a way to make sure you can access some of the concessions, because there is the duty concession for the intergenerational transfer of assets for the equity component, but any consideration paid or payable, loans, debt taken over in connection with a transfer of an asset will be deemed consideration, and you will have duty payable. So that has to be carefully thought about and planned and advice sought. And from 1st of July last year, the Queensland Government, without any notice at all, surprised us by introducing a concession for the inter-sibling transfer of farming assets, which had never existed before, and it was very welcome, but it's not as easy as it sounds. When you've got siblings that jointly own property, and it was done that way in the past, bringing them into the business, and at some point in time they want to split them, it would be nice to be able to not pay stamp duty on those transfers, which has always been the case, but it isn't easy necessarily to access this concession, because to qualify it has to be a gift. And you've got to ask the question, why would my brother gift me, you know? So you can work it out in a way. There might be gifting arrangements, but if it's all under one written agreement, or can be closely linked, that one transfer of an interest in one property is done, and then in return you're going to receive a transfer of an interest in another property, well, that will deem to be you're both getting consideration for the transfer of interest, which isn't a gift and won't qualify for the concession. But if with a bit of careful planning and a lot of trust between family members, it can be achieved. So it's something to keep in mind if you do have jointly owned property with siblings, that if there is a concession you might be able to access. So a quick little case study. This one was where George and Alice have got a farm. They got 3 kids, and the next generation is keen to buy the neighbouring property. George doesn't agree and just refuses to talk about succession planning. Just doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And ultimately, Craig, the one son, gets frustrated with the whole thing and just says, "Dad, that's it, I'm out of here." You know? So that's just a simple illustration, you know, how not talking about it can end badly. So within the case study, he goes through and talks about how we work with the clients to get them recover from the situation that they ended up in, and to get everybody talking and to develop a plan. And we did get a successful plan for them to move forward. From time constraints, I won't go into it. I'll leave it to you to read. But what we did was we negotiated an agreed plan. We got them to participate in a workshop, and out of the workshop we worked out management agreements and how things were going to be structured. They did end up agreeing to buy the neighbouring farm once we got them all settled down and back on track, and with some input from advisors they were able to move forward and manage the higher debt level of taking over that property. We got all the wills updated, and they've gone on from strength to strength ever since. Sometimes there are very hard decisions that have to be made, particularly when there's too many mouths in the trough for the farm to be able to feed. And that can be because, like, the farming enterprise just isn't big enough for the number of the children that want to come on and stay involved in the business. In those cases, it usually has to be where they just have to go away and get other careers and wait until the time mum and dad are ready to retire, because it just isn't possible for the farm to support the number of families. But going off farm and developing skills in other areas to bring back to the farming enterprise is a valuable thing. And you can agree that they work in both, or even in rotations where you have, you do 3 years and then you go away and the other one comes back for 3 years, and you just got to work out a plan that's going to work. But sometimes the only way it can end is for the farm to be sold if there isn't enough equity there to enable mum and dad to retire comfortably, because in the end they're the ones that come first. They have to be able to live a comfortable retirement, and the next generation has to make their own life. Okay, there's a second case study there which goes through and talks about goes through how we work with the client to look at their farm value gap. Whoops, wrong one again. How much we had to try to work on boosting the equity buy to get them across to achieve their objectives, and through having open family discussions we ended up agreeing on a plan to transfer livestock first, and the management of the business, with land to come at a later stage. We worked out what the generational value of the land is, which is the value, the amount of debt that the property can comfortably carry without putting the next generation under too much financial stress or risk, and the parents gift over the balance. And through them we go on to prepare a full estate plan, updating wills, putting testamentary trusts into the wills, the transferees of the land having to take out life insurance to mitigate the risk of the debt, and setting up trust for the grandchildren. So there's lots of things you can do. No two solutions will ever be the same, because all families are different. Right? Well, let's get into this interesting one about small business CGT concessions. This is a real case example. We've just changed quite a lot of the facts and figures and names to keep it anonymous. But in this case, the Smith Cattle Company, they had a family business with about 15,000 head of cattle, about turnover about $6.5 million a year in sales, and land assets of around $70 million, with a bit of debt to go with it. And the company operated on the land jointly owned by 3 brothers, who I've called the Smith Boys. And at that time of when we did this, they were all under the age of 55. And along with their wives and parents, they were 25% equal shareholders in that company. The Smith Boys also had their own cattle in partnership with their wives on their own property, so they were separate businesses from the main big family company. And the important point, they had also been running their own cattle on the jointly owned properties, but the family company also had cattle running on those properties. So the problem was the family reached a time where they wanted to reorganise the jointly held ownership of some of these properties to get them back into their separate names. And what they asked us, what would the tax payable on this be if we transferred that? So the capital gains tax payable on property A, there was a potential taxable capital gain of $2 million, and on property B, a potential taxable gain of $3.2 million, which would have meant a $1.6 million tax bill. So what did we do? So the solution was found when, after a lot of research and obtaining the right advice, we were able to establish that each of the three brothers were able to qualify for the small business capital gains tax concessions, even though they're shareholders in a sizable enterprise and had substantial assets. Now, you might wonder how that could be, but it was possible because each individual held less than a 40% interest in the Smith Cattle Company. When you look at those, you've got to look at that person and what's called their CGT affiliates, so that's their wife and children generally, and that was under 40%. The brothers themselves are not CGT affiliates, and just because they're partners in a partnership together doesn't make them CGT affiliates, and they only had a 1/3 each in that landowning partnership. There's a section in this particular part of the legislation that talks about whether they're acting in concert with each other. That's about whether they're conspiring to avoid tax, which they weren't. They just carried on their business activities in that way that enabled them to pass the tests. And the clincher was that the properties to be transferred were not used exclusively by the family company. They were used in their own individual cattle businesses on that land. And because of that, we were able to establish that they passed the small business turnover test, because it wasn't linked to the turnover of the large family company. It was only linked to the turnover of the individual businesses, which were around sort of 600, 800,000 each. There's rules that require you to aggregate the turnover of your businesses for the purpose of passing the $2 million test, but they weren't, in this case, none of those, the big company didn't have to be aggregated with the individual businesses. So what that meant, passing that $2 million turnover test is separate from the small $6 million small business assets test. They're mutually exclusive. So if you fail the turnover test, you can qualify for the small business concessions if you pass the $6 million test. In this case, they failed the asset test, but they passed the turnover test, so were still eligible. Which then opened them up for the assets to be treated as small business active assets, which mean they then get a 50% reduction in the capital gain, and then able to apply the small business replacement asset rollover concession to roll over the taxable capital gains on the interest in the property they're selling to the interest in the property they're buying, thereby pay no capital gains tax. The rolled over capital gain then sits in as a reduction in the cost base of the acquired interest in land and sits there until the future, and which can be re-triggered one day. But even that still reduced cost base will still transfer down on death to the next generation. So the only time it will be triggered is when the properties are actually sold. So by doing this, it was agreed, it all went ahead. No capital gains tax was paid. The only cost was the stamp duty, which of course unfortunately did have to be paid because there was no inter-sibling stamp duty transfer back at that point in time. But I do warn you, this is a complex area and you can't just jump to conclusions that you will automatically be eligible for small business CGT exemptions. So, getting towards the end here, we farm business succession is all about identifying your personal family goals and objectives, identifying what the risks are, to investigate your opportunities, provide direction for ownership and formalise management agreements, to get commitment from the whole family around what the plan is, and develop clear strategies for implementation and transition. And what you're aiming to achieve is a fully agreed on family succession plan, to agree on how the ongoing management of the farming enterprise is to be conducted and who's going to be doing it, clarify the roles, responsibilities and accountability. The farm ownership will continue and make sure it's done in a way that the assets are going to be protected, and most importantly, achieve growth for the business and the family, have happy relationships and have a more certain future. So thank you for listening to that today, and if you've got any questions afterwards, feel free to speak to any of the Powers agribusiness team. We're all here in the green shirts, and we'd be very pleased to have a talk to you. Any first meeting that you have us, it will be free, and at that meeting we'll help you complete a farm growth and succession assessment and then talk about how you want to move forward from there. So thank you again, and I'll now hand back to Kerry.